Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to QGTV Chapter Studies. Today we'll be trying to limit our video to 10 minutes because I've had some comments saying I've been going on a little bit too long, and I totally understand. Maybe we don't have all that much time, so let's try to get into it straight away. Today we'll be doing Chapter 5, Al-Maidah, and again I'd like to remind you the reason we're doing this overview is to understand the overall theme of a particular chapter. And one way to do that is to discover what exactly the chapter has which other chapters don't have. In the case of Al-Maidah, it's actually the name Al-Maidah will hint to us what exactly it is, and that is the story of Isa and Al-Maidah. So we'll get into that in a minute. Now let's begin the actual overview. Al-Maidah begins. So let's begin with our overview. It begins with a single verse passage, which is verse 1, and this is addressed to believers, or rather those who have believed. Now, what have they believed in? Now, if we try to read organically and try to connect the entire text, you can see that they have believed in the first mentioned parts of the Quran, which are chapters 1 to chapter 4. So let's assume they have already believed in this. What is God telling them? Well, God is telling them that to them has been made available a stable or constant blessing from Allah, which is Bahimatul An'am. That's actually in the verse. So this is the theme of Al-Maidah. Al-Maidah begins with this, the An'am, or the blessing from Allah. Next we move on to verses 2 to verses 5, which is again to those who have believed. So they've already believed in the first part. God is now describing to them the perfection of the system. So how do they make the system perfect? That's in verse 2. The signs of the perfection, that's in verse 3, and it includes the famous phrase. Again, it's a phrase, it's not an entire verse. You need to read the verse in full. The phrase is Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum. This day I have perfected for you your deen. So that's a sign that we have reached a certain stage. Next we have verses 6 to 7, which people usually interpret to be the ablutions, but actually it is about the characteristics of those who are rising for the salat. What is the salat in this case? Well, the salat is the actions required to bring about the states in verses 1 to verse 5. So God is telling you, if you want to establish this, this is what you need to do. And it continues to verse 7, which talks about, again, the ni'mah, or the blessings of Allah. So this is the first step in the action plan, if you like. Then the next segment is again to believers and talks about establishing justice. So that's another intricate part in the Islamic scheme of things, establishing justice. Next we move on, again, now to an example which talks about, this is verse 11 to verse 14, and talks about the blessings in the context of Bani Israel. What happened to those who were Nasara? They were followers of Isa, but after Isa departed, they lost sight of everything and they fragmented. Now we have verses 15 to verse 18, which talks to Ahl al-Kitab. So what is the Kitab in this context? Well, it refers to the system which has been established thus far, and it tells the people of the Kitab the coming of Kitabul Mubin, the clear book, and that God guides to the Subul Salam, the paths, in plural, the paths of peace. And once again we got the personality of Yahud and Nasara mentioned here. The Yahud and Nasara are people who do not quite fit the label of believers, and they are in the same system, but they act in certain ways which classifies them as different from the mu'mineen, or the believers. Next we have verses 19 to verse 34, which includes the story of Musa's experience with his people. So Musa actually tells his people to go into the purified land, but they refuse. So how does this relate back to our theme of the ni'mah, or blessings of Allah? Well, here we can see that because his people showed fear, it's fear which prevents us from going out there and acquiring this. This passage also includes the story of the two sons of Adam. So one of them, he has a sacrifice which is accepted by Allah, the other one doesn't. So the one who doesn't kills the one who does. This is a highly symbolic story which shows our the requirement for us to give sincerely in the way of Allah. And here Allah links the story of Bani Adam to Bani Israel, because essentially they are the same entity. Bani Adam and Bani Israel are two aspects of humanity. Now we move on to verse 35 to verse 40, which talks about acquiring a means, seeking a means to Allah. And for us to seek a means to Allah, we need to strive in His way. Now, interestingly enough, the verses about theft, the law regarding theft, is mentioned here. Now, why is that the case? Because theft is a contrast to honest efforts. So, in concordance with the theme of this chapter, theft is mentioned because theft is something which diverts us from acquiring the ni'mah, or the blessings of Allah. Then we move on to verses 41 to 50. Now this is the first time in the Quran, if you read on a sequential level, this is the first time the call has been made to the messenger, Ya ayyuhar Rasul, O messenger. And it talks to the messenger about the various people in his system. It tells him to establish, to judge with the Tawrat, and to judge with the Injil, and then mentions the Kitab bil-Haq. So these three elements actually make up the messenger system, which is, if you go back to the central theme, is for us to bring about the constant or stable blessings from Allah. Right, so that takes us to verse 51. Verse 51 to 53 talks about the people who are not totally into the system, Yahud and Nasara. Again, don't take them as allies. Then we move on to verses 54 to 56, another call to believers. Then it talks about our real allies, vital to the system's operations. Then we move on to verses 57 to 66, which talks about believers and their relationship to those who aren't believers. Also, this mentions the people who are the warmongers of the system. They're called the Al-Yahud because they are constantly turning and twisting. They're not actual believers. Then it begins again with a call to the messenger. So we have two calls to messengers in this chapter. The messenger here instructs the people from verse 67 to verse 86, and includes a varying personalities, such as again the Yahud and Nasara. Then we move on to verse 87 to 89, which talks about believers and correct consumption. So consumption is a major issue. If you want the system to run according to the Sunnatullah, the way of Allah, you need to consume everything. The consumption philosophy has to be accurate. Then we have the pitfall of the believers from verse 90 to verse 93, and it includes al-khamr, intoxicants, al-maisir, easy means of acquiring stuff, and these are the so-called a'malu shaitan, the work of shaitan. Next we have another single word passage where God talks about what we have gained, and God tests us with our gains. So if we follow God's principles, we will attain the ni'mah, but that's also our test. Do we surrender the ni'mah, give it a portion back to Allah, or do we keep it all for ourselves? Then from verses 95 to verse 100, we have uh, the means whereby we take care of our wildlife. Then we move on to verse 101 to 104, where the Quran is centralized in order for us to keep it flexible for problem solving. Right, so that takes us to verse 105, another a single verse passage, this time for the believers to guard their own souls. Why is this mentioned right here? Well, here we can see Allah has talked about testing us by means of our gains, showing us how to guard our wildlife, centralizing the Quran as a means for us to solve our issues. So now God tells us, guard your own souls. And if we do guard our own souls, we will be preserved from harm. Next comes verse 106 to 108, which talks about inheritance laws, making a will. How do we trust those people who are witnesses to our will making? Now we come almost to the final part. Here, first in verse 109, God mentions the messenger and their knowledge about Judgment Day, and apparently they don't know what will happen on Judgment Day. Now we come to the Al-Maidah part, verse 110 to 115, which talks about Isa's people. Now why are Isa's people mentioned here? The Hawariyun, why are they mentioned here? Because this table which descends is symbolic of God's system. It is for people to have the satisfaction in their hearts. Essentially, God's system is for that, for the fulfillment of our human needs. And this Maidah is representative of this. So if we have fulfilled the requirements from the beginning of the Quran up to this point, then Al-Maidah will be our reward. So that's from verse 110 to 115. Next we come to the end, which is verse 116 to 120, which talks about the scenario of the last day. Suddenly it comes out of nowhere. Why? Simply because this scenario is crucial for us to realize that the messenger's role was only this, to create the system. He was not meant to do anything else, intercede, have any special miracles or powers, nothing like that. He was meant to establish the system. And the system became Maidah, it descended from Allah, and Allah fulfilled the desires of those who followed him. So there you go, that's the gist of this chapter, the overview. And I hope you can again feed me your comments and criticisms. This is based on my reading, and obviously my reading is fallible like anyone else's. I hope you have benefited from this reading, and inshallah tomorrow we will be hitting Al-An'am chapter 6 of the Quran, which is about Tawheed. That's a very interesting turn in the text. Thank you very much for your viewership. Bye.